Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue aux séries 2021 de sessions virtuelles de CPC. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning for some of you in the West Coast, and welcome to the CSPC 2021 virtual session series. First, and before anything else, I would like to acknowledge the land where I'm talking from in Richmond Hill, Ontario. This is the traditional land of Mehrdad, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We would thank them and other indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. For this session today, we will have a conversation with Dr. Vik Pant, Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor of the Natural Resources Canada. Welcome to CSPC Virtual Series, Vik.
Thank you very much for having me, Mehrdad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. I read a very brief bio for Vik, but his full bio will be posted on the chat line. Vik is responsible for providing strategic directions to build capacity within NRCan scientific community, promoting a departmental vision for science and technology assessment for future needs. Vik earned his doctorate from Faculty of Information, iSchool, in the University of Toronto, a master's degree in business administration with distinction from the University of London, and a master's degree in information technology from Harvard University, where he received the Dean's List Academic Achievement Award. We joined NRCan from the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, and he was at that time a senior technical advisor for applied artificial intelligence. And once again, welcome, Vik, to virtual CSPC series. And I also want to thank the participants from across the country and welcome you to the CSPC virtual sessions. And please keep the conversation going using hashtag CSPC event series, which again will be posted on the chat line for your information. Before I begin this session and asking my questions, I would like to mention that the format of this session is that I ask a few questions from Vik for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we go to participants, and you can post your question into the Q&A box. And you can upvote any question you like, and please, if you have any technical difficulties, use the chat line to communicate with the organizers. So without any further ado, Vik, could you tell us your appointment as Departmental Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor? Tell us about the roles and responsibilities and how a Chief Science Advisor can help NRCan to achieve its objectives.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Mehrdad, for having me. I very much appreciate the partnership with the Canadian Science Policy Conference and the great work that you're leading, and I'm very happy to be here, and also I look forward to being back at the CSPC this year. I also want to start by acknowledging I'm in Toronto, and this is the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat and the Anishinaabe, and I very much am delighted to be here. So I want to answer your question by saying I joined the Natural Resources Canada Department in August of 2019, before which I was working at Mars, which is a high technology accelerator in Toronto. And I report to the Deputy Minister. I work closely with all my colleagues that are ADMs in the department and other colleagues. And really what this role is about has three goals. So the first goal is to look at the cross-cutting horizontal science policy files in our department and advance them in a meaningful way. So I'll give you a couple examples. One of them is the scientific integrity policy. So Dr. Mona Niemer, who's the Chief Science Advisor to the Government of Canada, her office had published a few years ago a model scientific integrity policy that served as the archetype based on which individual departments, such as the one where I work, were adapted and then calibrated a scientific integrity policy that was viable for our department. So that's an example. Another example is the Open Science Action Plan that was released by Dr. Niemer's office in February of last year. So taking that plan, adapting it, calibrating it to our department specificities, and then implementing that. So that is another example. There's other examples of departmental cross-cutting science policy files, such as the research scientist promotion method. That's one file. The management of the designated science conferences. So there's various aspects to the administration of these cross-cutting scientific integrity files, science-related files, I should say. That's one part of it. The second part of it, and which is why I'm very happy to be here at CSPC, and I'm always happy to come to CSPC, is to really promote and to foster partnerships between our department from a science perspective and other centers of knowledge, universities, research institutes, organizations like CSPC. So very happy to be a part of this, but also private sector organizations, because there is some amazing research that goes on also in private sector organizations in terms of science and research and development and technology innovation that helps the work that we do in NRCan as well. So partnerships and collaborations, I would say, would be the second piece. And the third piece, which I'm very excited about, although I'm excited about all three of these pieces, is really the digital accelerator. And the digital accelerator, which I hope to talk about in more detail today, is a launch pad where we can apply innovative technologies in creative ways to really accelerate the integration of science policy and science and policy making. So how do we take the outputs of the scientific process and use that to inform the policy making process, and at the same time have policies on science that actually enable and resource and support science in the best way possible. So I would say those are my three main roles. As I mentioned, I work closely with Dr. Mona Niemer's office, and I also work closely with other colleagues across the department that lead science files in various departments to make sure that there's knowledge sharing and collaborative learning at all times.
Thank you, Vik, for this very comprehensive response. And before I go to a digital accelerator, and which you explained well, I want to ask you about this network of chief science advisors under Dr. Nimmer's direction. And I know that many departments now have a network of chief science advisors. Could you just very briefly tell us about how many of you guys are, if you know the number, because I know the number is changing, and how do you work together in different departments?
Yes, absolutely, Mehrdad. And so that family is growing, as you very correctly said, that it is truly a very family sense. And it's 7 now, and I believe it's 9 by the most recent count, if you count the colleagues that are joining us at the table very soon. It's led by Dr. Mona Niemer, who is really the intellectual architect of a lot of the great thought leadership that comes out of there. And really what we do is, it's a forum where departmental science advisors can come together to share their experiences, to share best practices, whether it's something to do with technology, whether it's something to do with science, whether it's something to do with science and policy interface. So quite often we talk about individual topics such as scientific integrity or open science or publication policies and things like that. But other times it's to just take a step back and look at all of federal science on a systematic, system-wide basis. Because if you think about a department, even our department, we have some, incredible pockets of expertise. We have great world-leading scientists who do amazing science, and they're the top in their fields by any measure. And there is certainly a benefit in having those specialists, really their knowledge infused into knowledge of the science that is being done by other scientists in our department. So having that kind of a horizontal interplay and boundary spanning of knowledge, if you will, from one area of expertise to another area. And that happens to a great extent very, very well in our department already. But if you take a step back and you look at the whole government, that's also a very relevant goal for the government as a whole. And so when we come to Dr. Niemer's table, we really talk about this subject. We really talk about, okay, here's what's working in our department in terms of that horizontal view of having a portfolio, an ensemble of science going on a departmental basis that is truly in sync and harmonized. And I think my department is, I'm certainly a bit biased in saying this, but my department is an exemplar in that. If you look at our forestry service, Forest Service, you look at our geological survey, our Center for Mapping and Earth Observation, you look at our energy technology sector, our strategic petroleum investment office, all of the great science that goes on in those is not just science that happens in a silo, it's science that actually happens on a cross-cutting comprehensive basis. But then when you look at other departments, we also want to make sure that that kind of integration, that kind of unity and unification happens across the board. And that is the kind of thought leadership that that is discussed at Dr. Mona Niemer's table.
Thank you, Vik, for this explanation. And we very much looking forward to have all the members of the network of science advisors from departments in one of the CSPC functions in hopefully in near future or by the time of the conference, annual conference. That was great. So let's go back to the digital accelerator. And you mentioned what that is, but I want to ask you about the policy integration through innovative technologies. Can you elaborate what that means? You referred to that.
Yes, absolutely. And so, and absolutely, Mehrdad, that's a great question, because I think if we take a step back, when we talk about the digital accelerator, and even when I go into more details about the accelerator, the reason that we have a digital accelerator is to ensure that innovative technologies can be creatively applied to support the policy making process, right? At the end of the day, we are a science-based economic department. We work with economic policy. And so it's very important that the science that we're doing is informing that policy making process, and that the policy is in fact supportive of our science and resourcing and enabling our science in the best way possible. Now, what I mean by policy integration is this is very interesting about data. You know, when you think about data, there is, and we think about value of data. And by the way, I want to talk about this in more detail, but the idea is we can think about the value of data at two levels. One is the explicit or the direct or the overt level, which is that, okay, here is a data set. This was collected for some purpose. If we analyze it, if we mine it, if we model it, if we do different things, we can answer the question that we had originally collected it for being able to answer. So that I call the explicit or the direct sort of value of data. But to me, really where the exciting aspects of the potential value of data come into play is, Mehrdad, when we think about the notion of the latent or the hidden or the covert value of data. And that actually comes when you have a data set that was collected ostensibly for one purpose, but now you're combining it with some other data set that was collected for some other purpose. And now you're collectively applying those data sets to solve a completely different problem that you may have originally sort of either planned to solve using this kind of a process, or in many exciting cases have been pleasantly surprised at being able to address with this kind of use of data. So when we talk about policy integration, there's many ways to kind of think about that conceptually. But for me, what's really exciting about policy integration is, you know, we have policies that need to be consistent, that need to be coherent, because these are policies that interplay and come together in many interesting ways in the real world. So we want to ensure that the insights which are informing these policies are also compatible, that they are also internally coherent. And the one way to look at that is to think about data as a unit of analysis in the way that I described it, is that we're thinking about policies being integrated because they do work in the real world in unison, and they're designed to be as such, but then also all of the inputs that go into that policy formulation process or policy refinement or policy improvement process are also things that are internally consistent and internally coherent, to make sure that the entire value chain of going from data to that policy leading to benefits in the real world is all seamlessly and frictionlessly aligned. So that's really what is one way that I think about policy integration, but happy to dive a bit deeper into this as we go further into the conversation today.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Could you tell us the current challenges that Government of Canada is facing in applying digital technologies to support these science and policy integration that you were talking about?
Yes, absolutely, Mehrdad. And I would actually like to say that this is actually a problem, not a problem, but a challenge that all organizations are facing when it comes to applying technologies, including data, data science, AI, big data, etc. And this has to do with putting a value on an investment in technology, but specifically, let's talk about AI or data science or big data. Because one of the interesting things is, you know, I often talk to my deputy minister about this. Is you know, there is, when we think about valuing our asset portfolio, when we look at the buildings, when we look at the fleet of vehicles, when we look at the physical equipment, you know, there are well-defined models that you can use to put a number on it, right? And quite literally, it is a number. You can say, well, these are the benefits, these are the costs, and so you can work out some kind of a differential and figure out what that is worth. But when it comes to data, as I just described in my previous example, it's a lot more elusive, and I'm very encouraged to see that there are economists and management theorists who are working on these types of frameworks. And in fact, my team is also is working together with the University of Toronto researchers on making some kind of a framework that can be used to put a measure of value, measure of worth on a data set. But so to come back to your question is, this is really the main challenge, is when we are looking at making investments in artificial intelligence technologies, in data sets, which are going to be a part of that artificial intelligence value chain, Mehrdad, that is a non-trivial problem. That problem needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved in a way that the results are comparable, first of all, within a department and then across departments. And that's how you're going to be able to benchmark and compare and evaluate and assess performance on an ongoing basis. So from my perspective, this is a challenge that private sector organizations, universities, research institutes, us in the government are all dealing with. That is something that I think if we can solve that, or if we can make progress, and progress is being made, can truly have benefits beyond just our department, beyond just the government of Canada, and can also inform a lot better decision making. Because if we can't, we can't really manage what we can't measure. And so if we are spending monies, or any organization is spending monies to obtain and acquire technology, and as you know, Mehrdad, when it comes to AI, like any complex socio-technical system, it's not just about investing in the software. Now you have to invest in the computational capacity, you have to invest in the people, you have to invest in all types of other manners of expenses and assets that are complementary and that are supplementary. So having something that gives us a systematic and structured basis to truly capture and surface not just the overt, explicit sort of surface level value of data, but that potential, that latent, that hidden value of data, all in a comprehensive sense, I think that advance is going to really benefit a lot of organizations, including ours.
Right, thank you. That is very helpful for me to understand this. So in that case, Vik, I assume that scientists and policymakers, they need perhaps a different set of skills. In your opinion, what skill set will be required in future for scientists and policy analysts and policymakers in general?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, Mehrdad, and I'm already seeing a lot of that. Organizations are always adaptive, they're responsive, they sort of try to plan for the future, and they try to adapt their recruitment and retention policies in that way. I would say a couple of things. So first of all, I think that the notion of data quotient, the notion of data acumen, is very important. I think organizations need to have that in their organizational DNA. Is, not everybody is going to become a data scientist, nor is that the objective in any way, shape, or form. But I think to have an awareness of, okay, this is what data science is, this is what AI is, and equally importantly, this is what it is not, and this is what AI is not. And then here are some of the opportunities and the potentials, and these are some of the challenges and the risks. I think having that base level understanding, I think, is very, very important for science and policy professionals in the future to start with. Then I also like to say that, as I mentioned, Mehrdad, AI, data science, these kinds of systems are complex socio-technical systems. And by that, what I mean is that these are not just systems where you have some data set and you have some software and you put them together and presto, voila, outcomes value. What's important here is also to understand that you have human factors, which are going to be just as important in the success or failure of an asset or a technology being brought to the table than just the technology aspects themselves. So I think folks that in professionals in the future that are able to bring that kind of 360-degree view to the management of this kind of a socio-technical enterprise are going to be well positioned to succeed. And the third piece I want to also touch upon, which is very important, Mehrdad, is an integrative thinking. Because, think about, even when we talk about science policy integration, we're talking about integrative thinking. We're thinking about taking insights which are coming from the pursuit of science and through the performance of science, and that are going into the policy making process. And then policies themselves are enabling and supporting the scientific enterprise, because that's a virtuous cycle and a connection between the two. So I think if you are a scientist, having a deep understanding of the policies that your work influences, and if you're a policy person, having a deep understanding of the upstream science, upstream to you, relative to you, that is informing your science and helping you to do your job in an effective way, in an efficient way, I think are also skills which are very important. So, people that understand complex socio systems, technical systems, people that kind of really take a holistic, integrative view of the enterprise beyond and related to their job function. And last but not the least, folks that do have a baseline level of data acumen and data quotient. Happy to say that these are things which which I'm seeing in all organizations, in all industries, and all sectors. So certainly as a whole, we are all advancing in my mind, in a positive direction.
This is very interesting, Vic. Very good and interesting conversation for me. I'm learning a lot. Is this your vision for the integration of science and policy in public sector? Do you want to elaborate on that? But you said it very well, but I want to see in some other simple words how you envision the integration of science and policy in public sector using these technologies.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say thank you, Mehrdad, for the opportunity. I mean, I would say certainly the technology is a piece of it. It is a necessary piece, but it is not a sufficient piece. You know, I have a very optimistic and as I say, hope springs eternal. You know, I'm a very positive attitude towards the future of the public service, but also of science policy integration, particularly as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusivity. You know, I think that we're looking at a situation where we're going to very quickly, and already this is happening, is scientists that represent all segments of our society, policy makers that represent all segments of our society, and really just bringing that diverse myriad of views to the table that ultimately lead to better science and lead to better policy making. So in addition to the technology aspects, Mehrdad, I would also say I'm very optimistic about all the right movements in terms of the equity, diversity, and inclusivity aspects of the way that science and policy integration happens in our public organizations.
That's very good. Thank you very much, Vic. Now, I think it's time to go to the audience and ask, and the participants, please post your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and put your questions there. While people are, we already have one question. While people are adding questions, I want to ask the participants, please also answer a survey with three questions about your demography, where you're logging in from, and this will help us to plan better for future programs and sessions. I really appreciate if you could answer these questions. It's already posted. There are three questions about your career stage and which region of the country that you're calling from, as well as the sector that you represent. This is always helpful for us, this demography, to plan better for future programmings, and I thank you in advance for answering those questions. So let's go to the questions that are listed here. So I read the first question to you, Vic. When you mix data sets, this is from Aaron Maxwell, when you mix data sets or use data sets for something not for their intended purpose, how do you reconcile data? How do you reconcile the idea of data ownership or data stewardship? For example, if you're using personal identifying data, do you require that people who were the subject of data collection be informed of new uses of their data? I'm thinking in terms of the GDPR and other opt-out process laws.
Thank you, Mehrdad, and thank you, Aaron, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking question. I very much appreciate your asking this question. Thank you. That's a great question. So in my mind, there are two ways in which to answer this question. And I think the more, practical way to answer it is to think about certainly the technical aspect of mixing data. And certainly, you know, you've touched on sort of the other aspect of it, which I want to touch on in a moment. But certainly when we have different data sets and we're trying to meaningfully interconnect them, in some cases it may not be possible. In other cases it may be possible, where you need to have some other kind of proxying and other kind of interconnections between those data sets that need to be made. But from a technical perspective, the technology exists in many ways in which you can take one kind of data set and in a meaningful way merge it or combine it, or in some sense relate it to some other data set. So that technology exists. But I think your question is very much deeper than that. Your question is more about the governance aspect, the ownership aspect, the stewardship aspect, the stakeholder interests. Absolutely. So, you know, I think that is really the more important thing to look at. If you look in the government of Canada, we have, for instance, the directive on automated decision making. We have the algorithmic impact assessment. But beyond those two, there are many other covenants. There are many other rule sets, mostly explicit, and which would be in alignment with some of the standards which you mentioned, or some of the other rules you mentioned around, for instance, GDPR or HIPAA or PIPEDA or those kinds of frameworks. so you're absolutely right. Even if the technology exists, doesn't mean that simply one can go ahead and willy-nilly start taking data sets and start mixing them in ways where they're being used in violation of the spirit in which they were collected originally. Absolutely, 100% agree with you. And that is why I think it's very important to have proper governance, proper oversight, proper monitoring in terms of AI applications, especially ones where these kinds of activities may be possible to happen. Number one. I want to go back to the technology piece too, though. Even on the technology side, one can look at this in two levels, because there is a technical aspect, which is that, okay, I've got some database and this database allows me to connect that data set with that data set. That's fine. But now when we look at some of the software technology behind data trusts, if you will, that's very promising for me. And that kind of brings the story full circle. So if you look at the Fraunhofer Institute in Europe, and they have something called the Industrial Data Spaces Initiative. Now it's called the Industrial Data Spaces Alliance, I believe. The name has changed slightly. And what they have, and they were working with some large software companies to come up with this, where you could take the technical capability of intermixing or combining data sets, but then having on software the rules which are coming from the governance side of the house implemented, so that even if you were a bit sort of unscrupulous and you were going to throw caution to the wind and you were going to take some data sets, and even though you're not supposed to, still try to mix it, that in fact you wouldn't be able to. So it's not like if I exchange data with you, now that you have my USB stick, irrespective of what you've said to me, you can use it for anything you want to use it for. The reality is now that there is software technology that does ensure that, for example, on a more technical level, when you exchange data, you don't actually exchange just the data. The data goes with a wrapper. The data inside the wrapper is actually encrypted. And so you can only use it for the use cases and as many number of times as you are actually authorized to use it. So very good question. I think it's the governance, the technology coming together to enable that vision where you are combining, you are mixing, but at the same time, you're doing it in a way that is permitted and responsible and accountable and governed by proper rules. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Vik. Next question is from Alexei Haugen. Does the federal government's open science strategy and the intentions to provide open access to data affect the challenge of determining the value of data within the public sector and justifying the associated investments within or across departments?
Yes, that's another very, very insightful question, very incisive question. Thank you, Alexei, for that. I would say so. I would agree with the premise of your question, and I would agree with your question in the sense that just this morning, actually, for an unrelated reason, I was looking at the government's open data portal, and it's very interesting. They have a section there that has some facts and figures about how those data sets are used by the public. Now, of course, some public users are citizens, residents in the country like you or I, but also others are research institutes, other government departments, different level government departments at provincial territorial levels. And when you start looking at those kind of uses of those open data sets, you do start to appreciate that what I had talked about earlier, sort of the indirect value of data, where the data may have been collected, for example, as a part of a census, or for example, as a part of some kind of a survey, and they had a well-defined use, and that use was met, but now the data set was released in the public, and now all kinds of residual use cases are being powered by them. So to go back to your question, I do agree that, yes, I do think that when you're valuing the worth of a data set or the benefit of a data set, it shouldn't just be in the immediate sort of very short-term basis, but in fact, it should account for those types of long-tail utilizations that happen downstream. Now, the good part of this I want to touch on as well is simply releasing things out in the public. That certainly makes the data available, but it does, if you don't measure and monitor how it's being used, within reason, of course, it gets very hard to then actually do those calculations. So that's why I really like that section of the Open Data website of the Government of Canada, where they talk about, to the best of their understanding, how those data sets are being downloaded, what kind of analyses are being informed by those data sets. And it's not going to be perfect, and there will be some extrapolation, there will be some sort of modeling involved, but at least it's giving us some kind of a feedback loop, because as your question then also leads to the implication that then that decision that analysis can inform future decisions about what to prioritize in terms of release, in terms of a sequencing of what data sets go out into the open domain sooner rather than later. So great question, and thank you. And I hope that that goes some ways to addressing your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Vik. That was a very good answer and explanation. I have two more questions for you. And while you're waiting for other delegates, if you have questions. Number one is related to our federation. So one of the challenges, as always, in all jurisdictions and areas is the coordination and collaboration between the federal government and provincial and territories. And when it comes to policymaking, and that becomes hugely important to make sure there are some coordination, some talking. Could you tell us if you have, and I'm sure you have, challenges with respect to this integration of coordination of this integration of technology with policymaking between federal government and provincial government? Are you or the department or other departments are in exchange of information with provincial departments at that level, or there is not a dialogue yet established, not a systematic dialogue? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, happy to comment on it. And in fact, I'll do it with reference to an example that anybody can go and use your search engine of choice to get to this system. There is a system called the Open Science Data Platform. I encourage everybody to please use your search engine of choice to get to that website. It is truly a gem of collaboration between multiple federal departments and close partnership and teaming with provincial, territorial governments as well as other sources of data in addition to that. So the Open Science Data Platform is an excellent example with which to answer this question in my mind, because the Open Science Data Platform takes myriad data sets from multiple different sources, meaningfully interconnects them, and presents them on a publicly available web browser-based experience that can be used to answer all kinds of different policy questions. Now, the main intent with which this tool was built originally was to enable more access to information around cumulative effects and impact assessment studies. But of course, when you look at this website and the system on the website, and you see how many data sets they have, and it's all geospatial. So you can do not just analysis on cumulative effects or impact assessments, but any other kind of analysis as well. And on that website, we actually list the sources of these data, and you'll be very pleasantly informed to find that it's data from NRCan, data from Environment and Climate Change Canada, data from Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I mean, the list is very long, and also from many provincial and federal, provincial and territorial partners and municipal partners. Now, an important thing to point out here is, I wouldn't say a problem or challenge. I would simply say procedural requirement, and for good measure. As Alexei's question previously asked, when we talk about making one data set from here, combining it with that data set from there, collectively, yes, it may lead to more meaningful insights, but there are still contracts, there are still terms and conditions governing each of those individual data sets. So I don't look at it as a problem or a challenge. It is a procedural requirement. It is a processual mandate which has to be performed, which is where we openly and transparently work with our provincial partners, with our territorial partners. We tell them what the goal is. The goal aligns with their goal as well, because ultimately it also benefits their stakeholders and their constituents and residents. And we arrive at a solution like the Open Science Data Platform that really brings together multiple data sets together, so that many different personae, many different user groups can conduct interesting and innovative research using a tool like that. So very much, I would say, please look into that system, and that is an exemplar of the kind of collaboration that is possible, and partnership that is collaboration between all levels of government, but also players outside of government as well. Thank you for the question.
That is a very good answer. Thank you, Vik, for that. There's a question from Colin Kemp asking, what are your thoughts on implementing specific data standards within and across department organizations and departments, e.g. SDMX, which I don't know.
Yes, so absolutely. That's a great question. And thank you for that, Colin. I think the question really gets to the importance of standards. if we're talking about integration, we're talking about unification at all levels, whether we're talking software, whether we're talking process, whether we're talking structure, governance. Standards, in my mind, are certainly useful. They are certainly valuable, because if we're talking about interconnecting data sets, if we're talking about interlinking processes, because ultimately it's not just also about the data sets themselves, they're also about then you're training a machine learning model on a combined ensemble of data, and then you're ensembling that model with other models that were trained for similar purposes to collectively lead to better predictions. But that is still just a software part of the equation and the data part of the equation. There is actually a overarching process in which this kind of a prediction will flow through informed decisions leading to change in the real world. Of course, those processes are carried out within structures and there's governance around it. So I'm a believer in standards simply because that is a way through which, you know, to use this colloquially, multiple things can talk in the same language. And I think that the less that is being lost in translation, the less that is being misunderstood at any level, whether it's humans or whether it's software, it's a step in the right direction. I do feel that in certain areas, though, standards are better established and better accepted more generally. I don't want to use the word universally, but more broadly accepted than others. So in certain areas, for example, when it comes to things like even privacy, you know, we have specific privacy legislation, we have specific privacy related standards in individual jurisdictions, but it's not as though those privacy standards or regulations across jurisdictions are exactly identical or replicas of each other. And certainly that makes sense because they have different requirements and different contexts in which they operate. But that also applies to standards at all other levels. In certain areas, you have standards which are better accepted, well-defined, quite mature, and they're being used writ large. In other cases, there's a population of standards all competing. You know, as the joke goes, the thing with standards is there's so many of them. That is kind of a truism in certain areas. And so before adopting a standard, before actually embracing a standard, I think it is important to ensure that there is enough of a broad-based acceptance of it in the community that will interact with you and with your organization to do so. But yes, overall, I agree with the premise of your question. And I do believe there needs to be this move towards standard adoption, because that actually does reduce a lot of the misfirings and the mistakes that can happen when things aren't compatible, things aren't coherent, things aren't consistent or talking to each other in a meaningful way. So thank you for your question, Colleen.
Thank you, Vik. And I think unless there's another question, that may be our last question. I want to ask you from where I look at things, CSPC lens is in always a comparative lens when it comes to many issues. Just wondering if you have any approximate idea of how Canada compares to its partners, international partners, to the United States, other European countries, in terms of using this, digital technology, using data for policymaking and digital government. How are we doing? Are we far behind? Are we lagging behind? Or are we, comparable with other advanced nations, developed nations? How do you rank us in our performance with your first?
That's a great question, Mehrdad. And I mean, certainly, I could say that I have a bit of a biased view of this, being a member of, being a Canadian and being a member of Canada's government. But I would say a fair look at this would say, in most areas, we are on par with, if not well ahead of our peers. And I think the other thing that brings up is that we have very good partnerships with other jurisdictions all over the world. So when you look, for example, at the amazing work that is done in our Forest Service, the work that's done in our Geological Survey, work that's done in our Center for Mapping and Earth Observation and Energy Technology sector, they have world-leading scientists in their own rights, data scientists and domain scientists who are really advancing technology in their phenomenal work that they do. But they do so in close partnership with our allies from all over the world and allies that share in our values and our ethos and our ideologies. So what we find is if you were to compare us in that sense, I would say we are certainly on par with, if not well ahead of our peers in most areas of science and the application of technology to areas of science specifically. And I can talk for my department, but you look at forestry science, you look at geological science, you look at cartographic and earth observation science. I think our scientists are the best in the world, and not just in the domain science, but the application of data science to further propel their scientific domain further forwards. But I would also say that a lot of the research that they are doing, happy to report, is in conjunction and close partnership with our friends and allies from all over the world. And they are benefiting from us, we're benefiting from them, they're sharing knowledge with them, we're collaboratively learning from them. So I would say, Mehrdad, that it's a very good symbiotic, mutually synergistic, complementary, win-win relationship that we have with the other nations of the world in this area.
It was very good. Thank you very much, Vik. And one last question. We just got this, and with that one, we will end our session. It's from Stefan Di Giulio. My apologies if I mispronounced the name. Considering that there may be multiple data sets relevant to your needs, how do you assess the quality of data sets you choose to use?
Thank you, Stefan. That's a very, very good question, and thank you. I very much appreciate that question. This is a question that we deal with on a virtually a daily basis in the Digital Accelerator, and I invite you to contact us for more details, or if you can offer some help to us. It's interesting. So there is a qualitative, subjective way to look into this, and there is a somewhat more objective, quantitative way to look into this. So there are tools, there are transactional and master data management tools out there that we can use, and they do all kinds of statistical analysis of a data set, and then they give you some metrics which tell you the health or the wellness of a data set relative to some objective function or some purpose that you're trying to apply it to. But it's as much a qualitative and a subjective judgment. So one of the things we do in the Digital Accelerator, Stefan and Mehrdad and colleagues, is that we don't operate sort of like a turnkey model. We don't operate a consulting model where, hey, you're a domain scientist and you have some data science application you want us to work on. Give us the requirements, we'll turn the key and give you something on the other end. We actually co-create the applications together with them. And so to answer your question, Stefan, if you look at assessing the health or the fitness for purpose or the quality of a data set relative to some task, our digital solution architects, our data scientists in the accelerator are knowledgeable and equipped to be able to use the technical tools to come up with some objective quantitative metrics around the health or wellness of those data sets using some standard statistical techniques. But at the same time, it's the domain scientist who has years and years and decades of knowledge they bring to the table, and then they will also do a subjective evaluation of a data set and then basically say, well, this one looks right, this one doesn't look right, and have reasons for it. And at the end of the day, even if we do find, because your question is great, because even if we do find multiple data sets that may be relevant for answering a question, analyzing data isn't a costless enterprise. I mean, the bigger your data set gets, the more complex computationally your problem gets, the more cloud compute you'll need, the more GPU, I want to be very careful here of not naming vendors here, but GPU compute cores you're going to need to run your numbers and do your matrix multiplication and factorization and all that. So even if you have equally fit for purpose data sets, you may still have a trade-off involved, and you may still have to make a game time decision and say, you know what, for various computational reasons or various other cost management reasons, we may for this pass have to leave this data set out and include that other data set. So very interesting question. If you want more details, please use your search engine of choice, look up the Natural Resources Digital Accelerator, and that goes for everybody. Please contact us. We're always looking to partner. We're always looking to tap into the brain power, the collective intellect, if you will, of everybody that's a part of the CSPC network, and very happy to engage with you on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much, Vik, and we definitely will look forward to continue the conversation. Before ending, I want to first of all ask participants, thank you for your participation. Please, there will be a pop-up window, one question, and I really appreciate if you answer that one question. Rank this session. How did you like it? How did you perform? Always this feedback help us to do better next time. And once again, it's just one question after this. And the recording of the session will be posted soon on our website, and you can see all the previous sessions posted on the website. And if you have any other suggestion and idea for a topic, for speaker, more questions for Vik, please contact us at info@sciencepolicy.ca. We always look forward to hear your suggestion and your insights. And I want to thank Dr. Vik Pant, for Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor of NRCan, for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed this conversation. As we know that this is a very new and always developing story, and we would like to be updated on that, Vik. And I really hopeful that NR can propose a panel for the annual conference and to present this conversation with other partners in different forms and shape, and very much looking forward to stay connected with you and your colleagues. And once again, I want to thank the participants of the panel and wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you, Vik. The last word goes to you.
Thank you very much, Mehrdad, and thank you very much for the great work that you're doing leading the CSPC. I think it's an incredibly valuable and useful organization that brings together science folks, policy folks in a safe, inclusive, welcoming space where all ideas are welcome, and really in the spirit of promoting equity, diversity, and inclusivity of ideas and people. So I'm very, very thankful to you for that, and very much appreciate the partnership, Mehrdad. And absolutely, you can expect a proposal from us on continuing this conversation at the main CSPC conference. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.